Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. On today's show, we're talking to Ruairidh and Elena from Red Pepper magazine. Now, over the last 2 years, the Labour Party has undergone quite a transformation, with the left of the party becoming much more powerful. So, as a socialist magazine, I wanted to talk to them about their views on what's happened in the last 2 years, about the journey from Ed Miliband to Jeremy Corbyn, where the Labour Party's at now, and where it's going to go in the near future. If you like the show, you can subscribe to us on iTunes or on YouTube. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or you can even leave us a review on iTunes. So here's the interview. So, Ruairidh, Elena, nice to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having us.
Cheers for having us.
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to do the interview. I'm a big Red Pepper fan, so it was nice to be able to come and chat to you and see where the magic happens.
Well, welcome.
In a dank basement in Old Street.
It's not dank, it's brightly lit.
In a bright, airy basement in Old Street.
It's lovely. People who can't see, there's, psychedelic colours on the walls. And,
Dancing girls, elephants.
Yeah.
I wish.
Massive jellyfish tank. But
That's
yeah.
where all the subscription money goes.
Yeah, straight away.
Oh yeah. No money actually spent on reporters. It's all just hashed out in a binge of caffeine and Adderall.
Yeah, well, that's the only way to create kind of like good journalism nowadays, isn't it? You got to get those creative juices flowing. Otherwise.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Everything just runs on sleep deprivation. This is why, the first transitional demand is just 5 minutes lie-in. That's all we need.
Straight away.
Just a little nap, and then everything's possible.
Well, really, I should be angry and turning over tables and stuff, because I did apply to work at Red Pepper and then got wholeheartedly rejected.
For your job, actually. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you made that clear or not.
They're like Decca Records, babe. We're going to be, in 10 years' time, we're going to be kicking ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. You'd be like those guys who didn't sign the Beatles.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's an exciting time to be a socialist magazine, I'm sure. To be covering what's going on in the Labour Party.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just interesting that you kind of collapse those things into one another, because I guess there's sort of a strange moment in which, because obviously the phenomenon of left-wing movements not having friends in corporate media is nothing new. It's kind of, for as long as there has been corporate media, it has been broadly unfriendly to left causes, and Britain was one of the champions of the kind of media landscape that we're seeing sort of rolling out across the world. And you see kind of in its colonies, in Ghana, people Britain tried to press these kind of quite very sort of large scale corporate, quite centralized models of media control on colonial nations as well, as soon as the technology was there to be contended with. But it sort of feels weird to talk about struggling for socialism and struggling for the success of the Labour Party in the same breath. Not just because that's, not the Labour Party with which I've been familiar for most of my life, but it also changes the relationship between the independent media and the mainstream press, because of the sort of deeper implication of the mainstream press with Parliament and the Parliamentary Labour Party and the more kind of institutionalised branches of what we're now tentatively calling a socialist or social democratic movement.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure anyone knows quite how to tread that line. We're kind of used to being a bit more in the wilderness and a bit more sort of suspicious of parliamentary power than we ordinarily are. And we're like, oh, how do we report on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Eleanor got it hit it right on the head. I think it's definitely a weird position to be in, where for the last 10 years, but probably for the majority of the time that Red Pepper has existed, since the kind of mid 1990s, it's very much been that kind of like outsider voice. And Red Pepper is kind of unique in a lot of ways because you do have a lot of kind of alternative media that has existed for at least quite a while, or maybe not necessarily as long as Red Pepper, but certainly it's been around for a bit. And Red Pepper has always, Hillary Wainwright and a lot of the other people that kind of started Red Pepper, there's always been that attempt to kind of look into the Labour Party and its potential to become a movement. So in many ways, Red Pepper has been kind of waiting in the shadows, so to speak, right? I mean, we've been kind of like just staring at it going, we want you to be a social movement, we want you to be a social movement. And so when Jeremy kind of popped up in
Jeremy.
You're talking about him like a close personal friend.
When Corbyn came, I don't know.
Big jizz.
I feel like I'm his friend, I don't know. When he came up in 2015, it was this kind of, it was a really crazy moment for Red Pepper, I think, because it was both partially a kind of vindication in many ways of Red Pepper's desire to kind of stick with the Labour Party to a certain extent and be that kind of radical left-wing voice, or a platform for those voices, rather, within that kind of very tiny clique of people who had been in the Labour Party and who are left-wing and have been there for quite a while. And so when obviously Jeremy won, there was definitely a very strange moment where it was kind of like, oh shit, like we now have a leader in the Labour Party who's like written for us before and is really interested in the project and like knows Hillary very well. And I think especially around the relationships, I mean, it was like we got fast tracked almost, right? So you had before where we were competing with all these mainstream media sources that had all the funding, all the resources, and as a result of that, all the access to Parliament. All of them were basically thrown out and put into the same wilderness that we'd just come in from, because all of a sudden they didn't have the relationships with the MPs who were in Corbyn's kind of like inner circle. We did.
Yeah, and the social infrastructure that becomes the kind of basis of like building up a kind of a shared sense of purpose and a shared sense of reality, really, comes not from the kind of, I don't know, like cocktail parties in Westminster. It comes from, essentially you just need to look where the energy behind the Corbyn movement came from, which is really like a series of what we then called failed but maybe dissipated sort of social movements throughout the 2000s, like the tail end of the ultra-globalization movement, and then the 2010 student movement later on, and then factoring in this sort of new left review kind of generations for whom these questions were very live. I mean, this is the kind of the platforms and the kind of generations that were hosting Ruairidh Miliband's sort of questioning of what the relationship is between social democracy and the potential for socialism or communism, and like how should a left-wing project as a social movement orientate itself both within and without of the kind of formal structures of the Labour Party in order to ensure that we can claw back as much as possible as we can from the state, whilst always remaining kind of very cognizant of the limits of that tactically, which is obviously kind of completely ironic given the fate of his sons. Yeah, the whole steel joke that like Ruairidh Miliband wrote. You're right there.
Yeah, I'm not.
Yeah.
Sorry.
If you die,
I'm just
what
choking
do we
on
do?
your socialist right now.
Yeah, like he talked about how the Labour Party would always sell out the working class, and then produced two sons to prove his point.
Yeah. One more so than the other, though.
One more so than the other. Oh, bless Ed Miliband. I mean, he did, like...
He's my hero. He did a pub quiz.
Really?
Did you see that radio show where he was doing the death metal, like screaming, like it was amazing.
It's a bit. I'm so conflicted about it because he's clearly he so wants to have been exactly where Corbyn is, and he was been like. There are reports of him saying, I want to go down to like XYZ student occupation or XYZ picket line, and his press team or whatever saying, no, that'll look terrible, they'll call you a communist, they'll call you a Maoist, you'll get dragged through the mud, that sort of thing. And so he just didn't do it. So that's the kind of sort of rumour, legend that
that would never make you electable.
Oh yeah, terrible idea, right?
Yeah, terrible.
But then again, you know, he carved controls on immigration onto his own political gravestone, right? And like, I feel uncomfortable that the sort of return from the wilderness of Ed Miliband cleaves to a certain unwillingness on the contemporary left to confront not just conflicts or barriers that will crop up in, you know, whenever Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, that's the line, right?
Yeah.
But hurdles that have already appeared and like cracks that are already showing in a kind of truly radical programme, which is consistently comes on things like migration and policing. And yeah, I just, you know, I feel bad for the guy, but my God, like that was terrible. Like that was really honestly a very like like a dog whistle racist thing. I mean, like he was also the victim of dog whistle racism in his campaign, which is a level like horrible irony. But like,
for people who don't know, what exactly was his policy on immigration? So
he was essentially of the generation of the well. I was about to say generation like it's finished, but he was of the political mindset that thinks that electability is about triangulating xenophobic sentiment in the UK electorate, to say that, like, yes, you can kind of fiddle around the edges and maybe do some nicer things and maybe get capitalism to be a little bit nicer to the people who keep it going. I think Jeremy Gilbert's line is that these people see themselves as the corporate social responsibility department of global capital. But the fundamental thing that you must do to remain electable is to always keep a hard line on policing and immigration. And so what he promised to do is do more controls on immigration and have like set an absolute cap, something like stuff that could be like easily out of the playbook of UKIP, and that's the problem, right? Because you're never going to do like it's not just that it's racist and you shouldn't do that because it's racist. It's that it's a failed strategy as well, in my opinion, because you're not going to do racism more successfully than the Tories or UKIP and still appeal to your constituencies on which you depend, which is like, you know, lefties and liberals, people of colour, immigrants, that kind of thing. Like,
I guess it depends how you talk about it, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with suggesting that immigration controls, to an extent, might be, you know, beneficial for a country. Not in a way that you're like, that people are going, we don't want X foreigners here. It's more in a way that people go, okay, how many people do we need to improve the economy? How many people do we need in X area of expertise, and looking at what the country needs as a whole, rather than just saying we don't want immigrants. There's nothing wrong with saying that, in my mind, that like Theresa May's tens of thousands number is outlandish and stupid and ridiculous, right? But uncontrolled immigration isn't always the best goal. Well,
I disagree with where you're coming from there, because not just because it's a rhetorical move, right? To carve controls on immigration onto like a massive stone and to use that as like one of your main campaigning tools gives in to the idea that immigration is one of the main issues, one of the main problems we have in society as well. Economically speaking, it's not. That's a complete myth. And so like and all of these sort of economic problems that migration is supposed to sort of aggravate, like, you know, health, like burden on the health system, dragging down wages, all that kind of thing. These problems are non-problems. They are conjured out of thin air. And
I wouldn't say they're non-problems. I think they exacerbate shortages and issues that already exist, but that's because of a poorly run public services rather than the actual.
No, but that's absolute nonsense. That's absolute nonsense.
Well, okay, if you put more people in with the right, okay. So say we have a housing crisis, right? If you just built more houses, it would be fine.
Yes.
But they're not, and therefore the extra numbers exacerbate a problem that already exists.
But why are we? No, that's absolutely unacceptable.
If I may weigh in just for 1 second.
Yes.
So if we take your analogy, right? So if we go, okay, there's a housing crisis, there's too many people, not enough houses, right?
Yeah.
If you look at a place like London, the problem technically actually isn't that there isn't enough houses. There's loads of houses, most of them are empty, right? So I think what you're getting at, and I think the position that we would probably take, right, is that there are deeper systemic issues at hand here than immigration, and actually immigration well, certainly in my opinion, really doesn't contribute to that at all. I mean, the problem isn't that, again, if we take the houses, it's not that there's not enough houses, there's just too many empty houses. In the same way that actually, like, it's not that we can't give a hospital bed to every single person that needs one, it's that the funding just isn't there for
Yeah, no, like this is my point though. It's that the Tories will, or any anti-immigration party or party that feels that like immigration needs to be like substantially curbed, point at the public services that they're putting under strain already as being caused by immigration, when it might be a factor because of, both immigration and population growth will lead to a strain on public services if you don't expand them to deal with that population growth and immigration. But it's not that it's...
No, actually, no. It's also not like I do understand where you're coming from, and I do understand the logic, and then it's coming from like, we're sort of striving towards the same thing here, right? Which is better funded, widely available public services. But to cleave off immigrants as like a constituency like that whose presence is causally related to the housing crisis, the health crisis, the whatever, is sort of it obscures the problem. I think it's actually unhelpful because there's no reason to take immigrants as a particular constituency causing the problem if the problem is overall population growth. That could very well apply to, I don't know, people with blonde hair or people over 5'6". They're larger humans.
Or old people.
And this is the thing, right?
To be honest, that's probably more of an issue that needs to be dealt with.
Which is why immigrants per capita are actually fucking less of a strain on the on the NHS
than the contributors to the economy.
Yeah, exactly. And so, given that, why are we talking about them as like a drain on the economy when you're talking about population growth isn't necessarily a bad thing. The thing that sort of presents an enormous problem in the economy is a demographic shift towards people who are older, and that is not coming from immigrants who are, usually younger. Like, I don't want to talk about immigrants as this kind of supply of fresh blood in the economy, because I think that's kind of gross and messed up.
That's kind of what it is.
But
not so much in the UK, but in a lot of countries in Europe where repopulation rates are below
replacement rate. It's
yeah,
1.4
that's the
or
term.
something.
Yeah, replacement rate. So that's kind of what the immigration does for a lot of places in Europe. Not as much the UK as other places like France or I think there's one or two of the.
It's Germany.
Germany, is it? Yeah. That's genuinely a huge economic incentive for them to welcome to welcome open immigration, and that's probably why it's less of an issue for them. It's because they have that extra economic incentive that the government can point at and be like, not that we don't have that.
Yeah.
But I feel that that's another reason on the pile that it doesn't get as pointed at as much.
I guess there are different ways on which to assess the problem, right? And I guess by, you know, having worked on and like campaigns around migration and detention issues, I guess it always gives me the screaming heebie-jeebies to talk about immigrants in this way, right? Immigrants as whose presence and whose dignity is justified by virtue of their like reproductive capacity, because that means that like if you are you know, not productive, or if you are, you know, deemed a criminal, which is very easy if you're a migrant, then, you know, that's a kind of green light for a whole host of quite, you know, dystopian immigration policies that are, you know, as you point out, you know, some of the worst in Europe, and that's not exactly a high bar.
Yeah, I suppose actually to come back to the beginning with your question and why I guess the whole thing that's going on is exciting is that we can have these conversations though, right? So
exactly.
Like before having someone like Jeremy Corbyn in the kind of leader's office, I mean we had Ed Miliband, who was, as you quite rightly pointed out, like basically just kind of towing the line of the rest of the parties, right? Like he just kind of accepted that immigration was something that he was just going to have to do, and that was it. Whereas, I mean, to be fair, actually Jeremy hasn't been very clear about what his kind of stance on immigration is yet. But I feel like actually in some ways that gives me a lot of hope, because what I see in Jeremy in many ways and what I see Red Pepper doing, and actually a lot of other kind of alternative media organisations is really looking at how we can intervene in discussions like immigration, intervene in discussions like Europe, like Brexit, and try and change the kind of dominant narrative. Because the reality is right now, where the immigration debate was 5 years ago is very different to where it is today. And in the next 5 years, it could be pushed even further. Like the way that I see Jeremy Corbyn's role is for him to introduce a more progressive, more just kind of migration policy. It's for him to be able to stand up and say something that is very different to what the Tories and I guess like New Labour and UKIP and basically all the parties have pretty much just agreed with varying degrees of severity on how you deal with immigration. So I think that's what genuinely excites me most, is that we can have these kind of conversations and it's not just us going, well, oh, you know, this would be really nice, but we have a bunch of party politicians who are never going to say any of this. All of a sudden we have somebody who is rooted in the movement, who comes from this kind of ideology, so to speak, who has a wife who is not from here, who understands a lot of these issues in a way that like a lot of other politicians won't.
So does Nigel Farage, doesn't it?
So does Nigel Farage.
But like it's interesting that to see how Corbyn walks that line, because he's still to some extent the inheritor of the same institutional push factors as was Ed Miliband.
Well, he's very much exempt from I think anyway, from the... I feel like Ed Miliband kind of had this feeling that he was appointed as he was kind of allowed to be leader by the party establishment and kind of had to toe the line because of that, whereas because Corbyn came in as like this insurgent, essentially, and someone who wasn't really expected to be leader, he wasn't endorsed by any like major establishment figures when he first came to run, that his like rallying against it means that he doesn't have to toe the line in the same way that Ed Miliband was kind of forced to because of the position he was in and because of his family obviously as well.
I think this is where when you look at the kind of the weight of the pressure and also the money spent on like intellectual and cultural and political production around these sort of given ideas of like you need to embrace the free market and you need to be kind of sort of talk tough on immigration, etc, etc, etc. Given that, I think it's important to have an eye on where the arguments against austerity and where the new logics and these new common senses have come from, and I think that is that's where Red Pepper has played an enormous role, and where like loads of other either left-wing think tanks or academics who have one foot in the kind of 2010 like activist circles and much previous to that, all of these spaces were doing the tussling out of what would then become policy as soon as it was allowed the breathing space and the institutional permission to become policy. You have Perk at Goldsmiths and the IPPR, and like these places aren't sort of, you know, wildly off the chart radical. They've just been kind of like progressively doing more left-wing stuff over the past sort of decade. Just kind of like quietly in the background, there's been this kind of positive feedback loop between like activism and left-wing research and left-wing alternative media, kind of creating this sort of new, this like common sense like between ourselves that has been kind of, you know, vindicated, legitimated, and given energy by a Corbyn project. And, you know, as someone of an autonomous bent, I kind of like struggle with where to orientate myself within that. Like where, given that the energy and the cultural production came from outside the Labour Party, where's the future of that? Where does the future of that cultural production lie in that academic thinking? And like, I think there's no simple answer to that. There's you know, many strands.
Yeah, I mean, I think I try and combine some of that with something that I think you said, which was interesting, which was the way that you're kind of conceptualizing Corbyn as an insurgency, right? Yeah. And I think actually, I mean, everything that you said is absolutely right. And I think in my mind, one of the reasons why we saw Corbyn going and why Corbyn's position in many ways is unassailable is because of the reforms that Ed Miliband brought in that basically empowered the membership, right? I mean, I see a lot of what you just said, this kind of like intellectual current combining with people from outside the traditional Labour Party, so basically people who have been involved in movements 2010 and beyond and further back, and then I guess like kind of post 2011, that kind of era.
Well, I think
we kind of look at the membership in many ways, or in my view anyway, as the battleground, so to speak, right? I mean, it's whereas before, when we were having discussions about immigration, you would basically have to lobby MPs because it would be their choice as to who the next leader was, and a lot of the pressure from them would come. That's where it would come from in terms of policy making. I think now it's about convincing 600,000 people within the Labour Party, which in some ways is a much larger challenge, but in some ways is actually something that we're better equipped for. If that makes sense, like.
Well, I mean, I think there's the immediate. Like, convincing a politician is not the same as convincing a non-politician, ordinary person, because their concerns are just not the same. They have a completely different horizon. They don't necessarily have their sights set on, you know, their electability in 5 years' time. They don't really probably like give two hoots about the internal like structure of the Labour Party and the politics thereof. You can convince people purely on the basis of like the merit of the ideas and, you know, the emotional weight of the ideas, rather than the extent to which it sort of aligns with a certain given party common sense, which is, I mean, incredibly bizarre that move has resulted in this, because it was intended as a kind of shock to the unions,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the most ironic part of it, isn't it? It's
yeah.
Ed Miliband, the person who was most afraid of empowering the left, accidentally brought Jeremy Corbyn into office.
Yeah.
I mean, that is literally what happened.
Yeah, it's
right?
absolutely what happened.
Well, what was he asked? He was asked during an interview or like a press event while he was doing his campaign as leader during the election in 2015, where someone said, when are you going to bring back socialism? And he was like, that's what we're trying to do. And ironically...
Oops.
Just actually, while I remember, on the immigration point, Ipsos Mori have been doing like a 10-year poll on public opinion of immigration. And there's been a slow and steady rise in support for immigration from like down in the low teens, maybe 15, 20 years ago, the whole way up to like well past 40% now. I think it peaked over the majority of people just before the Brexit referendum, which is really ironic.
It's odd, isn't it? It's sort of well, it kind of makes sense given the you know, the whole for every action there is a reaction kind of thing, because when you've seen the rise of far right parties, and also, you know, the rise of since the migrant crisis, there has been a sort of a sense of urgency around these topics, not just to say, not just to dismiss anti-immigration fear-mongering as the fear-mongering that it is, but actually say that no, we need a positive policy orientated around this, about deconstructing borders and about migrant solidarity. I mean, I saw someone in the street, like just like a random person, like pushing a pram along, actually, with like no one is illegal t-shirt. Like that was like a really, really niche, very radical, like anarchist slogan, like 5-6 years ago.
Yeah,
and now
even less than that.
Yeah, even less than that maybe. And now it's,
now you can buy it in a t-shirt shop.
Exactly.
Sorry, did I steal that from you?
Stealing my line. There's damn plagiarism every day. This is what I have to deal with.
I'll put it in the footnotes.
There we go. Credit me, babe. So in terms of orientating like a positive demand, that's kind of where Red Pepper sort of swings. We sort of trade a lot in in the currency of cautious hope, which is how stuff gets done.
Yeah.
I think this is maybe Helen Hester's line, that hope is an enabling affect, which I really like. So yeah, I think that's we often have a lot of like researchers and like people who have a like slightly policy wonk streak to them, writing for us, because
do you love a bit of policy wonk?
Oh yeah, me too. Love it, because
I was going to say, if you're going to be really pedantic about the no one is illegal, that really depends on your definition of like where you're going to, because you could be like, morally I agree with the statement, but if you're going to be like, I was a law student, so if you're going to be really pedantic about it, you could be like, well, technically in China a third child was illegal, so if you
well, that's the thing. It's also like part of the power of the statement is the fact that it is kind of, it's so removed from reality. Like, of course there's like a million ways in which people are criminalized, and like Christ, like millions of people are illegal, right? Maybe billions. But it's kind of articulates a horizon towards which we can orient ourselves, and that sort of combination of blue sky thinking and the kind of like the detail of policy can kind of provide something to latch that optimism onto, because optimism without kind of anything to sustain it is just going to collapse like a flan in a cupboard.
Beautiful analogy.
Flan
in a cupboard.
It definitely, I can't remember where I picked that up from. That definitely wasn't me. But
well, you're on record now.
It's me. I originated that. Thank you. But with that kind of a detail of around which to like orientate action, and it can provide like like a genuine, like it can feed back into that sort of positive feedback loop I was talking about a while ago. So when you have like someone from, I don't know, like a Keynesian economics background, if you have like Anne Pettifor coming along and talking about how actually a pay rise is not just this kind of like utopian demand that would be nice and we should do it because we should be nice to people, but it's actually an economic necessity because you need, in this particular economic conjunction, to sort of prop up demand in a time of like failing productivity, etc. That can kind of concretize the like action around pay rises as not something that's this impossible, ridiculous demand, but something that's actually not only possible but necessary and urgent and very needed.
I do love the minimum wage argument, because if you look at the correlation between productivity and wage growth, there's this like moment about, it's between 5 and 10 years ago, where like productivity and wage growth go up sort of roughly together, and then wage growth drops off, and then about a year later productivity drops off, and you go, oh,
hang on a second.
yeah, what's going on here?
Like we're all paid shitty, and then we have the worst productivity in Europe. I wonder if these two things could be connected, right?
It's a good point you make, though, about like if we're going to live in a consumer capitalist society, then people need the money to consume. You can't have supply and demand working without people having the money to demand, essentially.
Yeah. And this is this is precisely the reason on which some people criticise I guess an Anne Pettifor-ish stance, because as essentially trying to save capitalism from itself, right? As trying to paper over the cracks in the contradictions of capitalism, and we need to demand something more radical. But what's nice about alternative media is that we don't have to pick one. We can give space for those debates, and which are incredibly valuable, to hammer it out, and to think about, okay, maybe we have sort of a Keynesian demand as a transitional thing, but we always orientate ourselves towards something more radical that represents a more profound change in which we organise society, and those kind of ideas can talk to each other. They're not just kind of restricted to their own kind of strange academic enclaves, all of which are excluded from anything that could ever become policy, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it was Mark in Peep Show very aptly pointed out
a few Peep Show references.
Yeah, I do. I've been binging recently. It's good to go back and rewatch
Peep
it.
Show is all I see.
And he very, very astutely pointed out that we are all here in the situation we're in because of the miracle of consumer capitalism, and there's absolutely no issue with attempting to reform, improve, streamline, make it more fair, more evenly distributed, and try and address the flaws with the system. But I think what a lot of people get turned off by is when people sort of pick one, as you were sort of suggesting there, that you guys have the space to discuss lots of different ideas and hybrids, or maybe ways to improve or transition towards different systems, and it's refreshing to see people open to different ways of pursuing things rather than just ideologically remaining rigid.
Yeah, so what you have in The World Transformed, and Red Pepper was a partner organisation, and Roy was one of the organisers. You had debates between economists about not about how much do we, I don't know, what kind of controls on the interest rate, and what kind of small monetarist policy can maybe jimmy the incentives in such a way that people aren't so desperate, that kind of thing. The debates that are being had are, do we talk about demanding wages and full employment, or do we orientate ourselves around a future in which work is automated and therefore full employment is not something that we should or could even be demanding?
Do you think we could ever, with the way technology is going, do you think we could really get to full employment?
I don't think. I mean, I want to abolish work. So
isn't that too loud? Yeah.
Not this job particularly. I just want to say.
Just any job.
Just in
every other job.
Yeah. As in, I think that embracing leisure and thinking about how we use technology to redistribute not just wealth and wages or whatever, but redistribute time and life, and who gets to exist untroubled by the necessity of striving to make a living to live again the next day. That kind of thing. I think that is is as urgent a question, perhaps more urgent in this particular conjuncture, than simply the the discussion over wages and working hours. I mean, this is not new. Keynes was talking about it. Keynes thought we would already have a 15-hour working week, right?
Well, that's my theory, is that I don't believe that work will disappear. I feel that. So Jordan Peterson, great guy, fantastic speaker, like unbelievable lecturer. If you haven't, check out some of the stuff on YouTube. He's just, I don't know what it is about him, but he's so
Those dreamy eyes.
He's so incredibly well read that you just listen and be like, wow, you just know things. But he talks about how life is it's inherent, like humanity is a struggle, and being alive is a struggle, essentially. And you know we have periods of pleasure and enjoyment, and periods where we were depressed or we're down or we're struggling with something, and that he thinks that essentially that struggle is an inherent part of being human. So I honestly don't see. I kind of have to agree with him a little bit that strive, that like struggle that people go through on like a daily basis is kind of a central part of being human, and I don't think work is going to disappear entirely. I feel like we're probably going to go to the
but it's interesting though, because it's almost like that you identify that the kind of like source of all our struggle and sadness somehow comes from work, right? Because you just put those in the same sentence. You're like, I don't think that work's going to go away, therefore I don't think that sadness and struggle is going to go away. But
it very much is like people strive to go to their new career and their new job, and then they get this point in life and this point in life and this point in life.
I'm not sure though that this is the problem, right? That we don't have two words for work. There's the work that's just like effort and labour,
like
struggle,
lifting something,
and I don't think that should, or I don't think that could obviously or should disappear. That's partly like it's you can have like very rewarding and these necessary forms of labour of all kinds, caring, creative, effective, and just practical. Lifting like moving furniture around, whatever. But when I talk about a horizon about the end of work, sorry, I'm talking about thinking about how we don't organise society around a wage relation.
Okay.
That sort of thing. So I'm talking. Maybe we're talking about two different senses of
a little bit, because personally I also think that we're going to move away from everything being like, while we'll have 3D printed things and like flat packed stuff, I feel that we're going to see a lot more people dealing in handcrafted stuff.
Yeah.
On like Etsy or on eBay or whatever, and that could be very much the way. But that also sort of relies on a UBI or some form of universal basic services or something to give people food, shelter, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
All interesting to theorize about.
Well, again, but it's all interesting to theorize about. But these are conversations that, like John McDonnell, for example, is having with people. These are conversations that that are legitimately being had. And I think what's terrifying for me is things like UBI. What's terrifying is that they're and really technology as well. You and I were having this conversation before we started the interview. Is who it is being deployed and used for, and who benefits from it most, right? And it all comes back to this whole like. It's kind of a way of thinking about it, in the sense that like when we talk about what the future of technology holds, or when we talk about what potential future kind of transformative transitional demands could be, whether it's universal basic income or universal basic services or a decrease in the working week or whatever it is, we also have to be talking about changing the kind of relations to production. We have to be talking about changing the way that we relate to and work with each other, right? Which is what you were getting at.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's all well and good to talk about, I suppose, like Keynesian economics or whatever it is, like whatever the topic is that we're deciding on the policy, but unless it like fundamentally looks at social relations, we are like massively missing the point.
Yeah.
And I think actually, again, we were talking about the manifesto before we came, and it's interesting because Corbyn's manifesto was without a doubt one of the main reasons why Labour did so well.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
The Labour manifesto is a throwback to 1945. Like, I mean, I know that the mainstream media were like, oh, it's back to the 70s, but it wasn't really back to the 70s. It's social democracy. It's saying we want full employment, It's saying that we want to pump lots of money into public services. What it's not saying, and what it's not necessarily doing, is going, we're in the 21st century now. Everything has changed. And how do we adapt that? Which I guess goes back to...
That's an interesting analysis of it. Richard Barbrick, who we were speaking to last night, was actually talking about how the Labour Party are planning to use some little bits of digital democracy technology to kind of crowdsource party opinion on UBI.
See, this is what Hart and Negri have been talking about in their latest book.
Did you get
Assembly. What do you mean?
And do you have it? Do you have the book?
Yeah, I
you
paid
for it.
I paid for it like a mug. Then when they're talking about the ability of left movements to remain truly democratic has been problematized as a question of leadership, right? So you have sort of this tension between the efficacy and directionality of a movement with leaders and the sort of kind of in quotes true unreconstructed democratic impulse of a horizontalist movement. And they say that the problem of leadership is framed as such because usually leaders do the thinking and people on the ground do the acting. And what they call for is a reversal of that tactic. Is that what you do is you decide on policy and ideas and strategy as a kind of collective, as a mass, as a multitude, which is their favourite word. And then the leaders kind of think about how to action that. And I think one of the criticisms that's been levelled against Momentum, for instance, is that they haven't taken on board those kinds of lessons. They're still doing the deciding and the wrangling out of policy from a kind of top down structure. And so they sort of deploy these activists, and it's not like the activists are just kind of mindlessly wandering through doing whatever leadership wants, but it's there's a clear allocation of time and resources that very much is shaped by the priorities of the leadership. And I think what's permitted by a kind of more digital democracy kind of angle is precisely this reversal, right?
To what extent do you think that's genuinely viable? Because I'm actually, attempting to put together the framework for a book about digital democracy and about what it could do. So I'm really trying to grapple with the extent to which it's really viable. Because so here's how I'm laying it out at the minute is that representative democracy came for two main reasons. So communication, because people could not be somewhere to vote all the time in a country larger than the size of Athens, where it was just all the citizenry voted on things, and you needed a representative to go from wherever you were to go and represent you. And the other thing was the time and knowledge aspect, in that people don't have the time to consume the information and gain the understanding that politicians are supposed to gain from studying policy and studying whatever they're talking about or voting on or representing people for. And I'm still grappling with the extent to which you can use digital democracy because of the
second one.
Yeah, because we've dealt with the communication issue. That's fine. You can get a poll of the country if you really, really wanted. You could get it probably in about a day. Realistically, if there was the resources to go, yes, we're going to put out a portal text message or a portal for everyone in the country to give their opinion on something, right? But that doesn't deal with the information issue. So
absolutely.
Look at the Brexit referendum. Look at the amount of shit that was talked and the amount of misinformation. And I just feel that until we deal with that side of it and teaching people to deal with facts and think critically and understand sources and like where things are coming from and inherent biases in different papers, different outlets, different speakers. We can't truly rely on the people to make decisions. Maybe that's being too critical of the people, but I do feel we have that issue.
There's a couple different levels to or responses that I would make to that. I mean, I think first of all, like, there is definitely a tendency to assume that because people don't necessarily have the political education to make decisions that they can't make those decisions. When in my experience anyway, working in lots of different kind of horizontalist organizations, the people who are often best placed to make decisions are the ones who understand through their experiences of politics, so their experiences of living in social housing, whatever it is, that actually come up with better policy than the person who's studied housing policy at university. In many ways, I mean, there are limits to that, but I think actually there's a lot of there's this kind of like fetishization almost of the expert. Which actually I think is part of the reason why, for example, we look at Brexit. Part of the reason why people basically got fed up of listening to economists being rolled out, going economically, this is really going to ruin everything. When people were sat there going, but I live in Barnsley, there's no work here. It is already economically ruined for me. They might not necessarily understand Keynesian economics. They might not necessarily understand what some of the things we've been talking about would be, but they understand what is in their experience, right? So there's that. I think also, like, this is where actually Red Pepper in many ways, this is part of, I guess, what the project of Red Pepper is, right? I mean, I think that there is for me, one of the biggest challenges now that we're facing, particularly now that we might not have an election for the next 5 years, is how do we increase the capacity of the movement and really society to be able to understand and formulate opinions that will drive the momentum forward. It's not enough to have a couple of people in the leadership office and a small group of kind of intellectual experts and think tanks all gathered around in a small circle, throwing out policies here and there, and us debating universal basic income when nobody understands what the hell we're talking about with universal basic income and whether or not it's a radical demand or not. What needs to happen is...
It depends on the extent to which you want to give it. Like, it depends where you draw the line. Is it like a supplement, or is it like the basis of most people's...
And this is exactly it, right? And I think the solution to that, and in my mind, this is actually one of the biggest priorities that we need to be focusing on, is effectively mass political education. And that can take the form of many things. For us at Red Pepper, what we effectively want to be is almost like a political education platform, right? Where people from all across the movement are able to put their ideas onto paper, and then other people read it, and then they're able to respond to it. And there's a kind of organic, ongoing, almost policy discussion. I mean, the way that Hillary likes to describe it is a policy hub from below. Whether or not I like the framing is a little bit off, but I think it kind of gives you an image of what we would like to be, right? And I think actually that really solves that second issue that you're pointing out, right? I mean, the issue I don't think is that people don't want to understand, or that people can't understand, or not even necessarily, as I said, that they don't understand, but there is definitely a massive need for a political education that isn't kind of your GCSE politics, which is like, this is how Parliament works, and this is what the Prime Minister does. And,
which isn't even...
Yeah, well, none of it's relevant anymore. People don't even vote on opposition day.
Exactly, but there should be a proper, and it should be participatory as well. It shouldn't just be people sat in a room with like maybe me going, oh, UBI is great, I really love UBI. It should be us sat in a circle with me introducing universal basic income, and then all of us talking about it. And often what you find is you start with one topic, just as we've done today, and then you end up somewhere completely different. And like, there's no way that you would have been able to predict that if you were just in a room thinking about the issue, right? You start with universal basic income, the next thing you know, you're talking about housing, or you're talking about whatever it is, right?
Because like, I think otherwise the kind of the mistrust of the demos sort of just re-articulates the problem, because what you have is an attitude that says like, you can't be trusted with these decisions, so we will have to make them for you, which only is that's just permission to kind of throw your hands up at the idea of political education per se, when really political education is also practical. It's also about doing things and finding out what's politically possible. We talk about, politicization or radicalization as something that happens to, I don't know, like young lefties in uni or whatever.
What happens is you go to uni and then you get brainwashed by the Marxists.
There we go.
That's what happened to me anyway.
Yeah, now we're here.
I walked in the Marxist Society, were like, here, have a beer, and I was like, yes,
I'm
Karl
home,
Marx.
yes.
Threw a really big beard really quickly.
You wish. But I think there is. We need to expand our ideas of what that kind of the practical aspects of politicization are. Whether that's about going down to like realizing what it takes to organize like a small demo in your uni and what it takes to kind of hand out flyers and persuade people, or whether that's like going down to the council office when you haven't been able to like secure a home that's big enough for like you and your family, and like encountering all of these barriers and thinking like, right, what do I need to do to get around this? Who can I depend on? That is also political education. And I think we would do an enormous disservice not only to, the UK electorate, like whoever does down like the UK electorate in abstract, either is incredibly patrician and says not me, obviously I know what I'm talking about, or is kind of does down their own sort of political capacities, because we all were once in a position where we didn't know shit about shit, but hey, like we all learned, and frankly there's nothing special about us. Like there really isn't. Like we happen to be here in this particular like social and economic position, but not because we are extraordinary people, but just because this is the hand that we've been dealt. And genuinely you talk to kids nowadays, particularly people who have grown up on Tumblr, people who have grown up absorbing and being very, very critical towards the media. That's also a political education, because what you're doing is you're continually encountering and contending with the deep imbrication of knowledge and power. That is a profound insight, and people are getting that at like 13 years old.
Oh yeah, have you ever seen the subreddit Late Stage Capitalism?
No, but I'm so sad I haven't.
It's just too real. I could just get lost there for days, just both laughing, crying, and sort of rocking back and forth. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Anyone, check it out if you haven't.
That's pretty much what we do in the office anyway.
We do that right after the trebuchet.
Yeah. Did we say that?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Never mind.
But yeah, so to kind of like move towards wrapping up here, where do you think we're gonna see the political and media landscape in 10 years? Where are we going to be at?
Oh God!
Wow, that's actually a really good question. I mean, okay, maybe we should start with the media side of things. I mean, I think, I mean, you say 10 years. I feel like 10 years is upon us now. Like, obviously, most of them, pretty much all of the most successful kind of like alternative media outlets, anyway, are almost solely online, right? And most of them don't even just solely rely on like kind of articles, basically, like written content, right?
Although saying that, like a lot of like the LRB, for instance, and Private Eye and The Economist, all those subscription magazines have seen like. I
mean, The Economist. Would you define them as alternative media?
No, so I'm just talking about things that are mainly like print, and also it's not like alternative media, but it's not like a main newspaper outsource.
True.
I wouldn't quite call it like. Obviously, it's very establishment, but it's not the same way of absorbing information. If you see what I mean.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think what I was more getting at though is so in the next 10 years or so, I mean, I think as long as we are seeing a kind of continuing increase in kind of people's desire to engage with politics in a way that isn't kind of confined to either electoral cycles in the Westminster model, or kind of like what the Guardian and the Independent and most of the mainstream media kind of churns out. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't kind of continue to see outlets like Novara, like Red Pepper, like The Canary, Private Eye, etc., etc. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't kind of continue to expand and to increase their kind of reach, right? And I think especially in the way that social media is going, I mean, there's probably just going to be more and more platforms, more and more different ways of engaging with people.
It's the problem obviously being funding.
Yeah, funding is the main issue, whereas
tell me about
I think
it.
the mainstream media in many ways has a really important decision to make. And I think, actually, let me be more specifically, I think the kind of like centre-left and centre mainstream media, so I'm talking about things, I guess, like the Times to a certain degree, but more like the Guardian and the Independent specifically.
I do struggle with calling the Times centre because it's just got that Murdoch tint
It does.
to it.
Yeah.
I know.
A little soup song.
But yeah, I mean, they have a really serious decision to make about what they want to be and how they want to present themselves, right? The Daily Mail and the Sun are going to be absolutely fine, because they're basically just, I mean, the Sun is basically just clickbait but printed.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, clickbait is going to do fine. Like, I will continue to click on cat images as long as I have Facebook.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But so they have some really serious decisions to make, and I think it's something that you and I were speaking about before this interview. Is that in some ways the Independent has been quite interesting, because if you look at the way that they've been covering Jeremy Corbyn specifically, but you can kind of take that as a microcosm for their general reporting, it has started to shift to the left, but for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, kicking and screaming.
And really they're shifting because they've woken up and smelled the coffee. They realize that like people reading things on their website means more traffic means more ad revenue, etc.,
Yeah.
right? And that's it. That's why they're doing it. And I think that's a really bad reason to do it, but at least they're doing something. The Guardian, on the other hand, I think is still stuck in this weird paralysis where on the one hand they're like, well, politically we just don't want to kind of like cater to what is actually a significant part of their audience. The Guardian, interestingly, did their own poll, and the majority of people who read the Guardian, or like a large proportion of them, supported Jeremy Corbyn back in 2016 than Yvette Cooper.
Yeah.
And they still, 2015. And they still backed Yvette Cooper in the end, right?
Yeah.
So they have a really serious decision to make, in the sense that people will start coming to us. They will, as our kind of politics becomes more mainstream, which it is, at least while Jeremy Corbyn is around, people will just start going, well, I'm not going to pay for this subscription to The Guardian when they're not reporting what I'm interested in.
Genuinely, we keep, obviously this is anecdotal, but so I work for Novara Media as well, and on the Twitter notifications, quite often you'll have people tweeting about exactly that dynamic, saying I've unsubscribed from The Guardian and subscribed to usually like Us and either like Red Pepper or Us and the LRB or The Canary, which I don't think is a particularly good sustainable model or desirable model of reporting either.
I enjoy a lot of their reporting, but I have issues with the way they present it.
Yeah, and pay their staff as well. Anyway. But it's the most unrequited love affair in media history. But yeah, and so saying I've unsubscribed from The Guardian, they are just they're shilling for the establishment or whatever, and I've like go and subscribe to, and then they'll like tag 4 or 5 media alternative media outlets, and that's genuinely, I mean, I wish those people were secretly millionaires, obviously, but I think that's potentially where the tide is going, particularly when a lot of platform ventures are funded by venture capital. That's not really sustainable for a magazine, because there's no ultimate moment in which you sort of the venture capital is cut off and then you monetize the business. It's just this kind of like ongoing cycle of production, right? And so venture capital may be out. You have the Washington Post, for instance, in the US, which just has these true to the US tradition of philanthropy. It's funded in large part by like enormous donations from like foundations, wealthy individuals.
They're much more profitable now than they were over the last couple of years, like especially post.
Yeah.
But largely because
election.
they've cut back staff, cut down costs, right? So they've decreased their actual ability to put out journalism.
But they've
also
they have pumped
specifically
more money into their investigative side, along with the New York Times. The both of them are doing some fantastic reporting and are seeing like a real renaissance in readership because of it.
Which is interesting because talking to someone who's a media analyst. He studies media, and was talking about this kind of like structural crisis in investigative reporting, because the technology that would allow a scoop to be profitable is just has been obliterated, right? Because now, you know, if you wanted to, I don't know, 50 years ago, if you wanted to read about like the equivalent of like the Snowden breaking news, and like it was in the Guardian, you have to go buy the Guardian. But now, as soon as the Guardian like hits publish, then it's, you know, it's immediately, you know, copy pasted into BuzzFeed and, you know, the Times and everywhere, essentially everywhere, everyone's timeline. And you don't even have to click through to the original Guardian article. They don't even necessarily get the ad revenue. And so when you think about, okay, why are we doing investigative reporting? It's a funny old juncture, because we need to kind of revindicate what was always the justification for doing investigative reporting, but when really it was kind of profit, which is the sort of, you know, like holding politicians' feet to the fire and, you know, speaking truth to power and that kind of thing. When that was motivated by profit, that was, you know, that was one thing. But now those profit incentives are not the same. You kind of need to, it's not like the necessity for good investigative journalism has gone away, but we need to seriously rethink about how we fund it, because we need to be very, very aware that it's not necessarily a profitable model. And so what do we, the bottom falling out of media models is a call to arms to reassess, okay, what media is important? What do we want from media? Which is, I guess, where the sort of the flexibility of a smaller alternative media outlet can be kind of profitable, because we are always having those conversations about, like, okay, what are we doing here? What are we for?
Yeah.
Are we a policy platform from below? Are we a, I don't know.
I mean, I think that also, you know, it also opens up a really interesting discussion around, like, what is what could a kind of, like, I guess, radical model of media also be like as well, right? I mean, some of the most interesting discussions I've ever been to have been about, like, cooperative medias, publicly owned media, you know, things like this. But publicly owned media, I know, is always kind of like little red flags in your head. You're like, wait, state-owned media of the BBC. Yeah. But I mean, more in the sense that, like, media that is kind of like localized, decentralized, and supported by communities, as opposed to because this is the interesting thing, is that people always forget that when we talk about the decline of print industries, most local newspapers have witnessed a small renaissance in of themselves. Like, I live in Walthamstow, and we have a local Walthamstow paper called the Walthamstow something, right? And, like, it has a readership of I think like 10 or 20,000 people. It's marginally profitable, you know, like you find it in cafes and stuff, like, and it's just a small local newspaper, but because, you know, it's kind of like got lots of stories by people written in the area, it's only about Walthamstow, and it's not really going viral because no one really outside of Walthamstow cares that we've just got a new slide, but it's awesome. It's a really good slide.
Where's the slide?
It's in the park near my house.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
People read it, right? So I think there's something to be said about how local media, which often actually they tend to be run, I mean, the Walthamstow one is a good example again, as cooperatives, because they can't be run as kind of like a big kind of profit model at the point, and most of the time there's only one or two people working in them anyway.
Yeah.
There is something to be said about the success that a lot of these local papers are having with that model, as opposed to, I guess, the kind of more corporate, like, business structure that you see with traditional media.
And we're very used to talking about how whoever holds the purse strings holds the power in terms of media when we talk about Rupert Murdoch, but that rarely transforms itself into a positive conversation of, like, okay, so how do we think about how it's funded in a way that keeps it democratic, right? And
accountable, right? I mean, I think that's what's so interesting, I think, about the potential for, I suppose, the the kind of collapse of mainstream media and the fact that we will have to kind of reimagine how media is done and what the model is that just like everything else, media needs to be radically reformed. Just like, we were talking about democracy, just like we were talking about the state of work.
Christ.
Media is another institution that needs to be reformed and changed. And often we don't think of media that way. I don't think sometimes, like, we kind of see media as, and I think actually alternative media to a degree is also guilty of this. Is that we often see ourselves as kind of a part of society in a way, like looking in as opposed to looking out, when the reality is that we are in the middle of it, and we are also an institution that needs to be reformed. Not Red Pepper specifically necessarily, but like
everyone else,
everybody else, we're perfect.
We're great.
And I think that for me is where I think some of the really interesting discussions can start. Especially when you're talking about something like The Guardian, which will have to have these, not necessarily these discussions, because I doubt that they will, but they will have to really rethink what they're doing.
Yeah. I mean, just partly because they're like,
because they're going to
they have no money.
Is it what, like $6.99 a month for a Guardian subscription?
I have no idea. I don't even want that.
And they've like 1 million subscribers. Like, I just don't understand how they're not profitable at that.
They've got a big giant building in King's Cross.
Yeah.
Like
they Bella Mackie,
sure that's not paid off already?
The daughter of Alan Rusbridger, former editor of The Guardian, is paid, I think, 70 grand a year, and she writes the occasional article about like why she brings her pug to a wedding and that kind of thing. Like,
70 grand a year?
Yeah.
I could write about pugs.
Yeah, I could write. Alan Rusbridger, if you're listening.
Yes, we will all write daily articles about pugs.
Because it's just like its budget is like weighed down with the necessity of class reproduction, right? And because it's largely populated by people who the same people who are generally like in Parliament, like people who did PPE at Oxbridge or whatever. Like, it's about
former BBC reporters,
all that kind of thing. So like when we talk about class reproduction, it's
champagne socialists.
It's not only like hey, both champagne and socialism are great. None of that.
I always find it a weird phrase.
Yeah.
So, champagne and socialism?
What's not to love?
Yeah, exactly.
What are we supposed to drink when the revolution comes?
Yeah.
How do you celebrate it?
I am an amphetamine communist.
Acid Corbynista.
Acid Corbynista, yeah.
No, I'm secretly much more boring than that. Anyway.
Glass of red wine and a cigarette Corbynista.
If only, like, mint tea. Mint tea autonomist. There's many hundreds of us. But yeah, you talk about class reproduction as how the reporting as something that sort of guides reporting incentives, as well as like how the budget is worked out, and what people are paid, and what you sort of expect from a job in the media is kind of faced with all these sort of necessities of like The Guardian being an institution that is like respectable and that you can go into instead of, I don't know, like a job in consultancy, that kind of thing, which is something that massively in my mind swayed the reporting on Corbyn, because the things that he was proposing were outrageous to the suggestion of the prospect of kind of class reproduction, and rightly so.
I think that's a nice note to end on. Thank you very much for chatting to me, guys.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget you can subscribe to us on iTunes or on YouTube. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or you can leave us a review on iTunes or tell your friends about the show. Until next time, thanks for listening.